The heavy steel vault groaned on its hinges, revealing what everyone else had abandoned 22 years ago. Sunlight pierced the darkness, waking decades of dust covering a dream the world had given up on. Thick dust swirled through the bright sunbeams, floating like smoke from a long-forgotten relic. Yet the shape waiting beneath that canvas tarp was absolutely unmistakable. Low-wide with fierce lines that decades of neglect could never truly defeat. A 1979 BMW M1 prototype, one of just 49 ever built, left to rot when the rest of the world moved on. Dominic Walsh stood frozen at the door, staring at the masterpiece everyone else had deemed dead. He instantly recognized this impossible machine. He knew every bolt, every seam, and the stubborn silence of its sleeping engine. Because over 2 decades ago, he was the last person to ever believe in it. Behind him stood Giselle Hartwell, her arms tightly crossed, wearing the smug grin of a total skeptic. "If you can make it run," she challenged, $10 million is yours. But she did not realize what you and I are about to discover. That this quiet father was the single person who still believed this dead masterpiece could live again. Dominic Walsh was 41 and looking at his ordinary life. There was seemingly nothing special to see. He woke up at 5:15 a.m. every single day in his tiny rented house in Hartford, Connecticut. Brewing coffee with a cheap machine, he stubbornly fixed 8 times instead of replacing it. Then he waited for those tiny footsteps to start shuffling down the hall. The very second his little girl, Violet, appeared in the doorway. Clinging tightly to her stuffed bear, with her messy hair flattened from a deep night of sleep. His tired mind found peace, humming in perfect harmony like a beautifully restored engine. 7-year-old Violet had inherited her mother's beautiful eyes, wide, dark brown, and incredibly deep. She watched adults closely, looking right past their words to see what they truly believed. She slid right into her usual seat at the kitchen table. Setting her favorite bear neatly beside her bowl, she locked her dark eyes on her father. "Are you coming home on time tonight?" "On time," Dominic promised her quietly. He leaned against the counter, drinking his black coffee standing up, just like every morning. "You said that yesterday. Yesterday an urgent car repair came up. Tonight will be different." Violet opened her breakfast and stayed completely silent. But she pointed Walnut to stare at him, silently demanding he keep his word. Outside, the tall oak trees lining the sidewalk were already bare and fading. A bitter October chill was sweeping down from the north, chasing the dying leaves away. But we know what Dominic once was. One of the most brilliant car restoration experts on the entire East Coast. In his 20s, he spent 3 grueling years in Munich, training under a legendary German engineer. A master who built the iconic BMW M series development program in the 1970s. Gerhard was notoriously cold, a harsh mentor who never offered easy praise. Yet he saw a rare spark in Dominic, the heart of a true believer. He had a gift for listening beyond the metal, finding the soul of a machine. Before they parted, Gerhard shared a secret that would guide Dominic when others gave up. "You don't just fix cars, Dominic. You have a conversation with them." At 20, Dominic didn't fully understand what the old engineer was trying to tell him. But by 30, he chose to believe it completely. You and I know true treasure hides where others give up. At 21, he quietly built his reputation. By 28, he had resurrected 4 classic BMW M series machines that others deemed completely hopeless. A spotless 1967 Ferrari, and a Jaguar Roadster abandoned as a hopeless cause in some Vermont barn for 31 years. He avoided fame, but the elite trusted his genius. Then tragedy struck, and Sarah was gone. The cancer moved far faster than any of the stunned doctors had ever prepared them for. Just 4 brutal months from diagnosis to the end. Dominic was pouring his soul into a tough Porsche 911 restoration when she got the news. He drove home that night and simply never went back. He sold off his specialized tools, the prized treasures he spent years painstakingly hunting down. He called every client and contractor, bluntly telling them he was taking an indefinite leave. He never expected to return, and he did not. He simply gave up on his gift. Now he just worked at a humble local garage, a mere 12 minutes from his empty house. Grinding through simple oil changes, basic brake jobs, and routine transmission flushes. His boss was decent and never expected miracles, which suited a broken Dominic perfectly. His modest paycheck barely covered rent and Violet's school. with maybe enough left for a fresh box of wax crayons when hers wore to nothing. Yet every night once Violet slept, he retreated to his tiny hidden backyard workshop. It was not a real garage, just a cramped space barely holding a workbench and a stool. There he opened the notebook, hidden like a secret treasure in his locked drawer. Its yellowed pages were filled with intricate hand-drawn engine diagrams, filled with brilliant technical notes in both English and German. The quiet traces of a genius mind that once dared to believe in its purpose. We all have hidden depths. He kept his locked away, doubting his own light. He did not know it yet, but that night a spark would challenge his quiet despair. The phone rang around 7 p.m., right as Dominic scrubbed the last of the dinner plates. It was an old buddy from his vocational school days. They had mastered complex auto mechanics together 20 years ago in a tough Connecticut program. But their paths completely diverged shortly after that. Owen went corporate, steadily rising to senior technician at the massive Hartwell Automotive Group, a luxury vehicle restoration empire that dominated the entire New England region. They rarely spoke, but Owen always reached out when something truly important was happening. "Dom, did you hear the incredible news this week?" "No." Hartwell finally opened that sealed storage vault down in their main sub-basement. Locked tight since 2004, there was a heavy pause. A 1979 BMW M1 prototype original chassis. The impossible puzzle they locked away. Dominic stopped wiping his plate. "Dom, you know what a treasure that is. Keep going." Giselle Hartwell, Richard's kid. She runs the empire since Richard died. She just held a huge press conference today. A public challenge, a legally notarized contract. Bring this impossible treasure back to life in 7 days, win 10 million. Anyone would be tempted. Applications closed this Friday. Dominic slowly sank into his wooden kitchen chair. From the living room, he heard Violet dragging her wax crayons across rough paper. How many applied? 47. A hopeless, beautiful dream was calling him. Even certified BMW engineers walked away. Stuttgart's elite restoration crew failed too. Even the master who rebuilt a McLaren F1 in Scottsdale left defeated. "Owen, yeah, why are you really calling?" A heavy, knowing silence followed. "Because I was standing inside that sealed vault today, Dom. I saw the abandoned car, and jammed right under the split leather passenger seat near the door, I found something." Owen dropped his voice down to a quiet whisper. "A blue notebook." I recognized the handwriting instantly. In that moment, Dominic stopped breathing entirely. "It is yours," Owen whispered. "I stayed quiet, but you need to come see." Let's look at the press footage Dominic tracked down the next morning. Giselle Hartwell stood watch by the open vault, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit. Camera flashes burst all around her like tiny, blinding white explosions of light. At 32, she projected the absolute confidence of someone who spent years, her whole life in boardroom meetings, where people always bowed to her authority. A fancy business degree and a perfect resume, but absolutely zero hands-on grease under her fingernails. She spoke easily about their buried treasure, that 1979 prototype chassis, telling the story of her grandfather buying the car back in 1982. Then she announced the hopeless challenge, smiling as if offering the car world a massive gift by letting them try. Dominic watched the footage wrap up, then slowly closed his heavy old laptop. "Stay with me on this." He stood up, walked to the door, and grabbed his dusty work jacket. Tucked deep inside the right pocket, folded tight, were 3 handwritten pages of a puzzle he had never stopped dreaming of solving. He threw that worn jacket on and drove straight to Hartwell Automotive Group. The lobby was made of cold glass and steel, filled with that quiet air only millions of dollars can buy. The receptionist gave him a cold look. It was the usual judgment corporate towers offer to working men who dare walk inside. A man wearing stained flannel and work boots greeted with polite, distant blankness. "I am applying for the restoration challenge," Dominic said. She asked, "Company or individual?" "Individual." He waited 40 long minutes on a soft leather reception chair. All around him, eager treasure hunters paced back and forth. A team of German engineers in clean suits carrying laptops and high-tech diagnostic gear. A big-name California builder Dominic recognized from a famous car magazine cover. 2 elite engineering professors murmuring to one another in complex academic jargon. We know that look of doubt. Everyone quickly turned away. Jason Keller noticed him first. Keller managed Hartwell's garage. At 48 he was heavy-set, wearing a flashy silver watch that no mechanic with dirty hands would ever wear to work. He had personally run 3 separate attempts to wake up that sleeping M1 over the last 5 years. Every single attempt failed completely. His entire career survived on the empty pride of being the only man who claimed to get close to the prize. He stopped right in front of Dominic, his face twisting into a smug look that was dangerously close to mocking him. "Walsh, what are you doing here?" "Just handing in an application." Keller looked down at the handwritten paper gripped tight in Dominic's fist. He stared with the smug pity of someone watching a hopeless fool who actually dared to hope. "You are fixing basic brakes for Aaron Mills. Do you really think you can accomplish what everyone else gave up on? What could you do with a 1979 prototype that my top veterans couldn't even touch?" Dominic stayed quiet, holding on to hope, as Giselle Hartwell stepped from the main corridor. Charlotte Reeves followed right behind her, clutching a clipboard. Giselle scanned the room, her eyes freezing on Dominic like he was dirt on a classic. "Who are you?" she demanded coldly, skipping any polite introductions. "Dominic Walsh. I'm here to submit my official application." She glanced at his paper, then stared at his grease-stained, calloused hands, the mark of a true mechanic. "Where do you work now?" "Mills Garage in Hartford." A tense pause. "That is just a local shop." "Yes. You realize our other applicants are certified BMW engineers and elite Pebble Beach specialists." "I understand that, Giselle." She stared at him a moment longer before her whole expression shifted. She found his hope amusing, completely writing him off as a threat. "Application accepted, Walsh," she said, walking away without breaking stride. "Good luck." Once Giselle vanished down the hallway, Keller dropped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Do not waste your week," he warned, his voice surprisingly gentle. "That classic machine has been dead for over 20 years. Dominic grabbed his stamped paperwork, tucking his dream quietly into his coat. "It is not dead," he murmured. "It has just been sleeping. You and I should rewind to 2003, when Dominic was 21. Just back from Munich when Richard Hartwell first contacted him. Richard was 60 then, but still incredibly sharp and lean. He built his legacy on a deep respect for true machinery, not just massive inherited wealth. He owned a legendary BMW M1 prototype, chassis 4301079, one of 49 handcrafted treasures built by the Bauer Coach Works in Stuttgart. This was before production versions ever rolled onto the assembly lines. Richard bought it back in 1982 from Zurich for $300,000. This discarded classic sat locked away in dark storage for decades. Barely driven, completely neglected, and forgotten since 1996. But Dominic saw its soul securing a 6-month restoration contract. Moving into the vault, he spent 6 weeks learning every inch of the machine, just as his mentor taught him. Patiently making zero assumptions. He hunted down every single scrap of original blueprint and document. He even wrote to a retired bore engineer, a Stuttgart local, who actually remembered building this specific prototype. He stripped the car piece by piece, logging secrets in his worn blue notebook. He uncovered the hidden problems, not 1 but 3. You and I can see they were layered deep like geological strata. The real issue lay deep inside the Kugelfischer mechanical fuel injection. A heavy sludge of metallic sediment completely choked the pressure chamber. It was an experimental alloy BMW tested only during that 1979 prototype run. They abandoned the metal later because it degraded in this exact tragic way. Every elite specialist before him surrendered to the problem, blaming the pump. The pump was perfect. The prize lay behind the blocked pressure chamber. It was an impossible riddle, solved only because one man believed in a machine that everyone else had long abandoned. Let's uncover what that ruined component was actually meant to do. A second impossible puzzle lay rotting inside the damp Bosch ignition board. 20 years of dampness had ruined the logic circuitry beyond simple repair. It needed reprogramming, not replacing, and no one had made these parts since 1993. A simple swap was useless. The true answer lived deep in the logic architecture. The physical hardware was never the issue. The third flaw was almost impossible to spot, yet fatal, a microscopic crack buried deep inside the engine mount, entirely hidden from the naked eye. A factory flaw in a rare prototype chassis, something the brand never dared admit to the public. Dominic finally found the defect by running his bare hands over the front mount's lower left corner in the pitch black, feeling for a microscopic hairline crack that had been hiding there since day one. He documented all 3 hopeless issues in a blue notebook with obsessive, beautiful detail, recording every single measurement, detailing every material specification, the exact teardown steps required to cure each impossible flaw. It was the most grueling rescue manual he had ever poured his soul into. Driven by an instinct he couldn't explain at 21, but fully understood at 41. You see, when we refuse to give up, every detail matters because the truth always does. Then, Richard Hartwell suffered a sudden stroke. The new interim boss, Richard's son, stepped in and instantly killed off every project that did not promise fast cash. Dominic was discarded over a brief phone call that Thursday afternoon. They warned him the vault was sealed tight and he was strictly forbidden from ever returning to retrieve his own tools. They paid 60% of his contract, no warning, no explanation, and 0 exceptions. His priceless blue notebook remained locked inside that forgotten car for 22 years. The strict new schedule gave Dominic a tight 6 to noon slot every single morning. For the first 2 days of the challenge, he could work until 8 p.m. He left Violet with Eleanor Marsh, a trusted retired teacher of 68. Beside Owen, she was the only soul he trusted to protect his little girl. Violet paused by the doorway, looking back to ask, "Is it the car?" Dominic met her innocent, heavy question with a deep and quiet seriousness. "Possibly," he replied. She watched him silently, looking so much like Sarah. "Be careful," she whispered, slipping inside. He arrived at the cold concrete vault before 6 that Saturday. The guard barely glanced at his pass before returning to his morning coffee. He entered the freezing, pitch-black tomb and switched on his single portable light. He stopped cold, staring at the legendary M1 bathed in cheap yellow light. They had already stripped the canvas cover for the big public viewing, leaving the classic machine completely exposed, its silver paint dulled by over 20 years of resting in the dark. Its tires completely flat. Thick dust covered the glass, settling over the decades like an undisturbed blanket of heavy gray snow. Yet, we can see that glorious silhouette remained exactly as Gerhard once promised. Low, aggressive, wearing that legendary Giugiaro wedge silhouette, proud and defiant. Those unmistakable iconic air intakes. That aggressively angled glass made this forgotten machine look like it was tearing down the highway, even while sitting completely still. It lacked the cheap glossy flash of a modern showroom model. But you and I know that real beauty is found in survival. A masterpiece tested by decades of silence, proving its worth beneath an impossible mountain of problems. Dominic stepped to the passenger side, the ancient hinge groaning in protest. He lifted gently to save the fragile pin, then reached beneath the cracked leather of the worn bucket seat. Finally, his fingers wrapped around the little blue notebook, pulling it free. 22 years of accumulated dust fell away as he gently opened the very first page. BMW M1 prototype diagnosis, written by Walsh, November 2003. His own youthful handwriting from 22 years ago stared back from the faded paper. Laying the logbook on his workbench, he turned to the old diagnostic notes and began. Those first 2 days were pure methodical teardown, examining every tiny detail. No actual repairs, absolutely 0 new parts. He measured every old note against the machine today, hunting down hidden decay born from 2 decades of neglect. Those 3 massive engine faults, exactly the nightmare problems he remembered facing. But fresh challenges had quietly taken root in the darkness over the years. Dried, brittle rubber seals choked off the fuel lines. Corrosive patches of rust were slowly eating away at the engine bay wiring. A bone-dry fuel tank that demanded a brutal internal scrub before accepting a single drop. He carefully mapped out these new hurdles on fresh paper. Watch him closely here. He sourced vintage parts through Owen over in Pennsylvania. He contacted a classic dealer in Nuremberg, designing his relentless battle plan for the week. By the second night, Giselle marched straight into his quiet sanctuary. Dominic lay flat beneath the chassis, flashlight clenched in his teeth, listening to her sharp heels click against the cold floor. "Making progress, Walsh. Moving forward," he muttered from the shadows. Heavy silence. Those clicking heels stopped dead. The German squad ripped their entire fuel system apart today. They even got factory originals from Nuremberg. Dominic remained completely unfazed and silent. I am only sharing this, Giselle pushed on, keeping her voice flatly professional rather than openly hostile, because your odds of solving this impossible puzzle are dead last in this competition. Strictly business, right? He rolled out from under the heavy frame, sat up, and met her gaze directly. His face was unreadable. Thanks for the update, he replied with quiet confidence. She held his gaze for a beat too long before turning back toward the heavy exit. Watching her depart, he went straight back to work. Day 3 began with a blow. Arriving at 6 a.m., he noticed his main tool bag had been moved. Not stolen, just sitting in the completely wrong place. Far worse was his custom pressure testing rig, brought all the way from home. He spent 2 weeks crafting it to test the injection chamber without total disassembly. Now it sat gutted and sloppily pieced back together. The delicate calibration was ruined. A rival had dared to desecrate his sanctuary. Owen showed up at 8 o'clock, sweating bullets. Jason Keller had bypassed security to enter the vault. Late last night, under the excuse of picking up some forgotten gear. But here is the catch. Keller had no tools down there. Want to file a complaint with Charlotte? Owen asked. No, Dominic replied. It is minor. I can recalibrate in 40 minutes. Filing takes longer than that and costs time I simply don't have. Owen quietly watched his friend work. After 20 years, Owen recognized that rare absolute stillness in Dominic's face. This was not patience, at least not how most people understand it. It was the total focus of someone who refused to let an impossible problem stop him. But on day 3, the real crisis was not Keller, it was the missing parts. Those custom parts from Germany were stuck in customs for another 24 hours. The Kugel-Fischer pressure chamber insert. The heart of this revival was delayed until Monday morning. Without that crucial piece, repairing the main fault seemed entirely impossible. And without it, his entire dream of bringing this treasure back to life would fail. He called Aaron. I need 606106 aluminum, 3 millimeters thick and a CNC. Who do you know? Aaron stayed quiet for a second. Sam Whitfield down on Trumbull Street. He is closing shop and selling his equipment. You will have to talk him into this yourself. Samuel Whitfield was 70 years old, having spent 40 of those years as a precision machinist. He knew nothing of the hidden BMW and cared even less about $10 million. But when Dominic began describing the exact dimensional specs of the impossible part he needed built, listing off tight tolerances, surface finishes, and how the alloy behaves at high temperatures, Samuel listened closely to the entire pitch without interrupting even once. In the end, he simply said, "Come by this afternoon." Dominic left his warehouse at 11 and drove straight to Trumbull Street. For 4 hours, he stood by the lathe guiding the creation of an insert accurate to 0.002 of an inch. After 6, he returned, carrying the priceless handcrafted component safely wrapped inside his pocket. The 4th day was the ultimate test. He had dreaded this moment all week, facing the deep microfracture inside the engine mount. And the strict rules of the contest strictly banned any specialized diagnostic gear, keeping the playing field perfectly level. But he did not need any scanner anyway. He remembered exactly where that flaw hid, 22 millimeters below the second bolt of the forward mount, running lengthwise for about 8 millimeters. He reached right in and found it with a single touch, just like he had back in 2003. In the shadows, his finger traced the cold metal until that tiny, hidden ridge of the fracture finally caught against his bare skin. It remained completely unchanged. You and I know that a structural crack either spreads under pressure or remains dormant in quiet storage. This impossible challenge had waited in the dark for 22 years. He chose not to weld it. Extreme heat would only stress the surrounding metal, making an already impossible problem far worse. Instead, he trusted a classic cold bond technique using a metal compound epoxy. He applied it patiently alongside a perfectly measured aluminum backing plate. He clamped it tightly under heavy pressure using scrap materials while the epoxy slowly cured. Gerhard had taught him this old secret for fragile parts that simply could not be removed. When done with care, it was stronger than a weld, finally unlocking this legendary treasure. Let's pause here, Violet called at 11, right as he waited for that first layer to cure. Putting his brush down, he answered the phone. Are you okay? She asked. Fine. Are you okay? Yes. A sacred silence followed, the kind where a brave child gathers courage to speak. Mrs. Marsh told me you used to fix really special cars. She said you were the best, and you just didn't know it. Dominic stared into the dormant BMW M1's engine bay, keeping a forgotten dream alive under the warm light. We know the truth. This unfinished classic holds a raw promise that completed puzzles never will. She's a generous woman, he whispered. Ba. That Vietnamese word for father was a precious legacy, a piece of Sarah she refused to let fade. Do you think about mom when you're working? The heavy question struck like a sudden drop in pressure. Yes, he whispered. Me too, Violet murmured. I think she wants you to finish the car. He froze for a long, heavy moment. I will finish it, he promised. Sleep well tonight. He ended the call, his hand resting heavily on the phone. He grabbed his detailing brush and kept digging, refusing to quit. Charlotte Reeves stepped into the vault alone that night, leaving her corporate defenses behind. She paused at the threshold before finally speaking. I have been digging through the company archives, she said. Back in 2003, Richard Hartwell hired you on a 6-month contract to restore this exact vehicle. The agreement was cut short after 3.5 months when Richard suffered his stroke. The company paid out 60% of the contract, skipping formal notice and giving no written reason for ending it. Dominic slowly set his torque wrench down. That 40% with interest over 22 years now totals $460,000, Charlotte added. That is completely separate from the main contest prize. The company owes you this reward, regardless of how this week ends. I didn't come here to sue anyone, Dominic replied. I know. I am telling you because you deserve to know the true value of your dedication. He stared. What made you dig into this impossible mystery? Charlotte fell completely silent. Because you have spent 3 days in here, and you do not act like someone chasing a prize. She leaned her clipboard against the wall. You work like a man desperately trying to redeem something lost. Once she left, Dominic faced the engine bay again, standing completely still in the quiet vault. We know that people often abandon their creations, not from a lack of skill or pure will, but because life takes sudden turns we never planned. And some unfinished dreams get locked behind closed doors, buried alongside everything you simply could not carry when running away so fast. But those forgotten dreams never die. They linger, the way unfinished puzzles wait at the edge of your mind, occupying a space nothing else can ever fill. He had carried the heavy burden of this vintage BMW restoration for 22 years, never daring to name it. Standing inside the quiet vault now, the forgotten machine seemed to open up before him. With his tools carefully arranged, and the old notebook pages open to the exact right section. He knew that $10 million was not the true reason he walked through those doors. The money was just a consequence. The real reward was far simpler, yet harder to explain. You and I see it now. This impossible work demanded the right hands, and his were the only ones left. He finally picked up his wrench. Day 5 was the last full working shift before the classic demonstrations. At 4 in the morning, Dominic sat at his kitchen table, staring down the impossible task still left before him. Just 5 parts left. The rare German imports arrived Monday afternoon, exactly as promised. The stage was set. Dominic had exactly 9 hours inside the vault to work. He noted the target times in the margin, double-checking. Restoring the impossible requires absolute precision. Just barely possible, but enough. With no more setbacks, Dominic started at 6. Keller walked in at 7. They had plenty of space in that massive room, yet Keller completely ignored his own workbench. He stopped dead halfway across the room. He just stood there, staring at how Dominic resurrected this forgotten classic over 4 grueling days. The engine bay was completely reassembled, and the fuel injection system looked brand new. That complicated pump was spotless, the pressure chamber fitted with Samuel's custom insert. Every single line was routed beautifully, with fresh sealant locking down each joint. The delicate old ignition wiring harness was gently cleaned and rerouted wherever decades of rust had stiffened the wires. The heavy-duty engine mounts were rock solid, the fuel tank thoroughly cleaned and filled. Even the 4 original tires were finally holding air pressure once again. To the untrained eye, the treasure stayed hidden beneath dull, aged, and faded paint. Those heavy body panels still wore the thick dust of 22 forgotten years. But you and I know the real miracle was waiting under that hood. The message crystal clear. You brought back the original pump, Keller muttered. It never needed replacing. The pressure chamber was just blocked, packed with metallic sediment inside the pressure passage. I machined a brand new insert for the intake side, clean passage, original pump, flawless original function. Dominic kept his focus on the engine. Keller just stood there, completely speechless. The expert leaned in closer, studying the complex fuel injection setup. He studied every restored piece with the painful intensity of a man who had once tried, failed, and given up on this exact riddle. The problem was never impossible. He simply lacked the vision and had been looking in the completely wrong place. You've worked on this exact car before, he finally said. It was no question. It was absolute realization. Dominic simply picked up his torque wrench. Keller stood there for one more heavy moment, then quietly retreated back to his own workbench. Now, you and I must look at the real mountain here. Reprogramming that old ignition board was the ultimate test. Modern technology had completely abandoned this system. That original 1979 Bosch control board was entirely missing from modern databases. The industry had given up on this technology decades ago. Its ancient logic system was created long before modern diagnostic tools even existed. Other experts wanted to throw it away and swap in a newer replacement. But Dominic chose a different, completely manual path of patience. Inside his worn blue notebook on pages 41 through 48, he had fully mapped the original logic sequence. He traced it point by point with a simple multimeter over 6 hours in November 2003. Recorded in his own shorthand, because the world had thrown away the official manuals. To this day, it remained the most dedicated masterpiece of engineering he had ever created. He preserved it with the absolute devotion of someone who knew its true value. He knew years ago that restoring this discarded masterpiece would one day change everything. Dominic gently turned the worn pages to 41. The manual restoration took exactly 2 hours and 18 minutes. One wrong connection and you and I both know it all fails. There were simply no second chances left. He worked in dead silence. No radio, no checking the clock. Just the circuit board, his notes, and hands tracing steps written 22 years ago. Because you and I know true treasures hide behind impossible problems. At exactly 4:13 in the afternoon, he hooked the board back to the circuit and applied power. The dashboard warning lights woke up in sequence, 1, 2, 3. Each glowed in perfect order, exactly how the original factory startup logic demanded. Then, one by one, they faded to black, system running nominal. Dominic dropped his testing lead and sat there, completely frozen for a second. Owen arrived right at 5. He paused at the edge of the bay, staring at the rebuilt engine, the spotless space, and the clean wiring. He stayed quiet for a moment. "Dom," he finally said, "you actually did it." "Not yet," Dominic replied. "One step left." Owen just stared. "What step?" Dominic held his gaze. "Starting it up." Violet called around 6 that evening. "Are you almost done?" "Almost. Are you going to win?" Dominic stared at the vintage BMW M1 resting under the light. The paint still showed its age. The body wore every scar time gave it. But underneath that worn shell he felt a pure certainty. Reviving a machine others gave up on reveals the treasure inside. It was ready to wake up. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. "I did everything I possibly could." The phone went totally quiet for a moment. "That's enough then," Violet replied. "Mrs. Marsh always says that's enough." He cracked his first real smile in 5 days. "I'll be home before 8. He told her, "Set Walnut at my spot for dinner." The final showdown was locked in for 10 a.m. on Friday morning. The vault's massive steel door finally rolled up, revealing a wide concrete pad with plenty of room. Enough space to drag these abandoned machines out for the judges to evaluate. Giselle Hartwell stood with the 5 judges, Charlotte, and 2 corporate lawyers. They even hired an outside master mechanic just for this competition. Plus a cameraman, brought in to record every single moment. The morning dragged on as the other hopeful mechanics took their turns. The German restoration team begged for a 3-day delay, just to finish tracking down rare parts. The judges shut them down. Contest rules were absolutely strict. So they gave up. But the California specialist got his car cranked. The motor sputtered, running violently rough for 17 agonizing seconds until a terrible knocking sound forced him to kill it. His second try gave him absolutely nothing. He packed up. 3 more challengers failed to even reach the testing phase. Their engines stayed dead, proving they could not revive what others had long given up on. Then Jason Keller stepped up. He ran a 2-man crew for 7 straight days, and their prep work looked solid. The old BMW he was wrenching on actually fired up. It choked and struggled, staying alive for 42 seconds before the thermal safety system killed the power permanently. The judging panel quietly wrote his final time down. Keller just stood there, hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring at the dirt. Dominic was up last. He pushed the M1 onto the apron himself. Manual pushing was required for safety. Now we will see if daring to believe finally brings the ultimate reward. Sunlight finally touched this forgotten treasure, rewarding 22 years of quiet, patient faith. In the bright sun, its faded paint stood proud, wearing decades of neglect without apology. The low curves of that Giugiaro design, the sharp raked windshield. That long, elegant sill line, to true believers its magic never faded. Decades of silence could not destroy this classic. It only gained character, standing as a stubborn survivor of an impossible test. Giselle stepped closer, staring into the open engine bay Dominic had so carefully protected. She looked at the intricate machinery others had long deemed hopeless. Then she saw the passenger seat where a worn blue notebook lay open to old notes. Charlotte stood close, tracing her eyes before looking directly at the believer himself. "Walsh," Giselle whispered, "is that notebook yours?" "Mine," Dominic said. "Left it there back in 2003. Last time I was here." A heavy silence fell over the room. Giselle stared, her professional, skeptical doubts completely shattering in an instant. The polite, dismissing smile she had worn through all of our doubt was suddenly gone. She stared at him, showing the expression of someone realizing this devoted man was the true treasure she had dismissed. The official stepped forward. "Mr. Walsh, you can begin." Dominic reached for the driver's door. It opened effortlessly, the reward of his meticulous care over the last few days. He climbed inside, settled into the seat, and embraced the forgotten cockpit once again. The air smelled of 22 years of dust, worn leather, and aged rubber, yet a pure mechanical heart waited underneath. A sleeping giant, untouched by the years, ready to reward his stubborn devotion. He recognized that soul, the silent mark of greatness waiting for someone who never gave up. Scanning the old gauges, he firmly gripped the steering wheel. He exhaled. Together we watched him turn the key. For 10 agonizing seconds, only the starter groaned, testing everyone's fading hope. It was the heavy strain of a sleeping giant finally struggling to awaken. Ancient fuel lines surged with pressure for the first time in over 2 decades. It was deliberate, patient, and determined. A forgotten icon slowly remembering the greatness it was always meant to achieve. Suddenly the engine roared to life, no hesitation, no struggle. It settled into a perfect deep idle in just 2 seconds flat. A mechanical symphony, just as promised 40 years ago, rewarding those who dared to believe. A rich and steady, glorious song from a classic straight six that had waited 22 years for someone to unlock its secrets. The entire room stood frozen in absolute awe. The temperature climbed smoothly, finding its perfect mark on the dashboard with a calm, flawless rhythm, proving that nothing inside was broken or weak. No warning lights flared, just the pure, unblemished voice of true victory. No failures. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3, pure perfection. Dominic finally shut it off, opened the door, and emerged. You and I see the ultimate proof of faith as he stood there. For once her skepticism faded, leaving only the quiet shock of absolute truth. True treasures always hide behind impossible odds. Inside that boardroom, the silence was deafening. Charlotte slid a $10 million contract directly across the polished table. Every term matched exactly what Giselle promised when this impossible restoration first began. Dominic stared at the life-altering paper, his breath catching slightly. This massive payout meant a real home for Violet, a massive backyard, and a bedroom filled with warm morning sunlight. It meant the best schools, his own mechanic shop, and reclaiming the prized tools he was forced to sell years ago. Yet he laid the pen down without signing a single line. "I need to ask you something directly," he said, as Giselle quietly waited. "Do you know why this classic BMW was abandoned for 22 years? Absolute silence. It was never impossible. Plenty of talented mechanics could have saved it. The corporate board decided way back in 2004 that restoring this rare prototype with absolutely no market value just was not worth their massive financial investment. He held her gaze without blinking. An original prototype chassis like this with a fully documented history at today's high international auction prices. It was worth $8 to $10 million before I even touched a single wrench. Fully restored and certified, its true value is far higher than that. You did not set this challenge because you truly believed the car was dead. You did it because you assumed no one could revive it in 7 days without millions and factory backing. You and I know the treasure was close. The boardroom fell dead silent. You are absolutely correct, she admitted. That was my exact reasoning, and now? She let out a heavy sigh, showing her first real moment of vulnerability all week. And now I owe you $10 million. Dominic picked up the pen and signed. Once the signature dried, Charlotte placed a second thick folder onto the table. This is the leftover balance from your 2003 contract. With 22 years of interest, it totals $460,000. Our company will wire a separate settlement payment. Dominic could only stare at her. You did not have to do this. That old debt belonged to the past. Charlotte answered, it should have been resolved a long, long time ago. Giselle quietly folded her hands on the table. And regarding my comments in the lobby, when I said your chances were the lowest, I was dismissive in a way that was completely uncalled for. She paused, sincerely apologized. Dominic remained completely silent. You simply did not know any better, he replied. That is not bad faith. He left the high-rise at 4 o'clock, driving straight to Eleanor's home. Violet ran outside before he could even reach the front steps. Her stuffed toy was tucked under her arm, blue crayon smudged across her cheek. She stopped when she saw his expression, tilting her head. Done, she whispered. Did the big car run? He knelt down to her level. Yes, he smiled. The engine started. She wrapped her tiny arms around his neck, holding on tight. With her toy squeezed between them, Dominic finally closed his eyes. His mind drifted back to Sarah. He remembered that quiet hospital room where she begged him never to let go of his passion, even for their daughter. You and I must remember, the greatest rewards always belong to those who never lose faith. Let's look at this together. He remembered that blue notebook and 6 freezing hours holding on to his belief. Back in November, he mapped that ignition board by hand, tracing a hidden treasure others had long abandoned. Even at 21, he knew this obsessive precision was how you respect what others throw away. He still heard Gerhard Wolf's voice echoing, you have to have a conversation with the machine. This conversation with a forgotten machine took 22 years, but his faith finally paid off. He stood up, took Violet's hand, and walked straight toward the car they rescued. For 3 days he quietly finished ordinary jobs at the garage, honest work that waited patiently while he chased his dream. On his last day, Aaron shook his hand, holding on a bit longer in silent respect. It was exactly what he needed. That evening, Owen called him with incredible news. German engineers had contacted Hartwell, desperate to collaborate on the tech they once abandoned. They wanted to know about that impossible Bosch board. They needed his reprogramming method, believing his patience could cure what seemed broken. 9 other unrestorable classic BMWs sitting forgotten in dark European vaults. Dominic promised to think it over. Then Giselle called his personal number that Saturday. I want to offer you a long-term consulting role with us. Choose your own projects, work from anywhere on your own time. A quiet pause followed, stripped of her usual cold corporate tone. Our team in Stuttgart asked where you learned to do this. You studied under Gerhard Wolf for 3 years. He was one of the few who truly understood the M-series development from the inside. Most experts in this field have never even heard his name. But then, most experts wouldn't have needed to. Dominic answered quietly, send the contract terms through Charlotte. I will look at them. She paused, her voice softening completely. They want to know what you call your restoration method. They want to document it for our official archives. He simply stared out his kitchen window. In the other room, Violet hummed softly to herself, a beautiful habit inherited from her mother, a quiet reminder of what they refused to let go. It does not have a name, Dominic replied softly. It is just doing things in the right order. Silence fell on her end. Finally, she whispered, "That is the truest definition of mastery I have ever heard." Think about this. After she hung up, Dominic sat in silence, realizing his belief paid off. The $10 million was just a byproduct of holding onto a dream others abandoned. He had plenty of time now. He learned that choices made with slow, deliberate patience always endure far better than anything rushed in a moment of panic. But he had already made one quiet choice on his long drive home. He would build a sanctuary for forgotten machines, small, quiet, and deeply personal. A humble space filled with a lift and the right tools. Just enough room to revive one neglected car at a time with the respect it deserved. He kept a secret unwritten list of other forgotten legends. 7 impossible cars hiding in dark storage units across the country. Forgotten engines with their stories left unfinished. You and I know the truth. They are just waiting for someone who dares to believe in them. Once Violet finally fell asleep, I slipped into my quiet, dimly lit backyard workshop. Think about this. I sat down, spreading an old blue notebook under the harsh light. The last page held my final notes from 2003. Written by my younger self, it detailed an impossible BMW restoration I abandoned long ago. I uncapped my pen, turned to a fresh blank page, and wrote today's date with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Unlocking this legendary dormant treasure demanded my absolute respect on paper first. A way to prove to everyone that this impossible dream still matters. That this dormant treasure is worth recording. That it must be done right, and so I began.